On the night shift in hospitals, one nurse had a chilling secret. His name was Charles Cullen, and over the course of 16 years, he became one of America's most infamous angel of death serial killers. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of how a seemingly ordinary nurse slipped through the cracks of medical institutions and left a trail of dead. This is the story of Charles Cullen. Imagine a nurse making their rounds at 3 AM, delivering medication, checking vital signs. That was Charles Edmund Cullen's world. Born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, Cullen would go on to become one of the most chilling figures in medical crime history. Over a 16-year period, he used his position of trust in hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania to kill dozens of patients, all while hiding behind the facade of caring and competence. Publicly, he was just another night shift nurse. Behind closed doors, he became known as the Angel of Death. His confirmed kill count sits at 29, though he has confessed to up to 40 killings, and some investigators believe the true total could be in the hundreds. His method was deceptively simple and disturbingly effective: small overdoses or tampering with IV lines, the kind of quiet interventions that could be mistaken for medical complications. But these were not mistakes, they were choices. Long before Charles Cullen ever put on a nurse's uniform, the warning signs of instability were already present. Born into a working-class family in West Orange, New Jersey, Cullen was the youngest of 8 children, growing up in an environment marked by poverty and loss. His father died before Charles even turned a year old, leaving his mother to raise the family alone. From an early age, Cullen struggled with a deep sense of isolation and emotional turmoil, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. At just 9 years old, he attempted suicide for the first time, an early sign of the mental instability that would later manifest in much darker ways. His mother, the one stable figure in his life, died tragically in a car accident when he was just a teenager, and that loss seemed to shatter what little stability he had left. Cullen reportedly felt abandoned and adrift, even lashing out when the hospital refused to let him see her body. After dropping out of high school, he joined the US Navy in 1978, perhaps searching for structure and purpose, but even there, the cracks widened. His fellow sailors saw him as odd, detached, and increasingly unstable. He was once found wearing a surgical mask and gloves, while sitting silently at the controls of a missile system, a bizarre and unsettling act that got him demoted. After several suicide attempts, Cullen was discharged from the Navy and redirected towards civilian life. After his discharge from the Navy, Charles Cullen seemed to reinvent himself. Seeking direction, he enrolled into a nursing school at Mountainside Hospital, an opportunity to help others, to build a respectable life, and to channel his need for control into something good. He graduated in 1987 and quickly found work as a nurse at St. Barnabas Medical Center. Colleagues described him as quiet and intelligent, but socially awkward and emotionally distant. He married a woman named Adrienne, and together they have 2 daughters, seemingly settling into the rhythm of family life. But behind closed doors, the same darkness that had followed Cullen for years began to creep back in. His marriage was plagued by reports of bizarre, controlling behaviour. Cullen allegedly abused the family's pets and poured lighter fluid into another nurse's car as an act of revenge. His wife would later describe his unpredictable temper and chilling demeanour, saying she often feared for her safety. Professionally, however, he was thriving, or at least appeared to be. Working night shifts surrounded by vulnerable patients, he found a space where no one questioned his authority. Hospitals often view nurses as caretakers, but for Cullen, the role offered something else entirely: the power of life and death. It was here, in the sterile corridors of St. Barnabas, that the first suspicious deaths began. Cullen later confessed that he killed his first victim in 1988, a patient suffering from a severe allergic reaction. His motive, he claimed, was to end the suffering, but even then, the line between mercy and murder has already become blurry. In 1988, at St. Barnabas Medical Center, Charles Cullen quietly began what would become one of the deadliest killing sprees in American medical history. His first known victim was a patient named John Yengo, who had been admitted following an allergic reaction to a blood thinner. Cullen later admitted to administering a lethal overdose of medication, framing it as an act of mercy. But this was not mercy, it was control. It was the chilling thrill of playing God. Over the following years, similar mysterious deaths occurred. Often patients were not expected to die or whose conditions had been stable. Cullen targeted the most vulnerable, those on IV drips, those who couldn't speak for themselves, and those who trusted their caregivers completely. He used drugs like insulin, digoxin, epinephrine, medications that could easily cause death when misused, but were common enough to avoid suspicion. When hospital audits began uncovering irregularities in drug inventories, Cullen resigned before he could be questioned, moving to another facility without consequence. This pattern would repeat itself for over a decade. Each time questions arose, he would simply transfer to a new hospital, leaving behind a trail of unexplained deaths and grieving families. The hospital system, bound by bureaucracy and a fear of liability, never reported him to authorities. It was easier to let him go quietly than to open the door to a scandal. And so, Cullen's dark career continued. Charles Cullen drifted from hospital to hospital, carrying death with him wherever he went. After leaving St. Barnabas Medical Center under a cloud of suspicion, he was soon hired at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. There, 3 elderly women died under mysterious circumstances after receiving insulin injections, each one reporting a strange nurse had come into their room before their deaths. Yet, again, nothing was done. Cullen's quiet demeanor and clean record made it easy for him to slip through the cracks. Hospitals were desperate for qualified nurses, and the lack of a centralized reporting system meant that red flags never followed him to his next job. In the early 1990s, he worked at Hunterdon Medical Center, where he killed several more patients, digoxin overdoses, each death conveniently written off as a natural cardiac failure. To his co-workers, Cullen was odd but competent, someone who kept to himself, worked nights and did his job without complaint. But that detachment was part of his mask. He learned to manipulate his surroundings, exploiting the chaos of hospital life and the trust of his peers to hide crimes. Administrators turned a blind eye. It was easier to blame coincidence than to confront the horrifying truth that a nurse, someone sworn to save lives, was deliberately taking them. By this point, Cullen had become skilled at masking his killings with clinical precision, and the medical system itself had become his accomplice, protecting him through silence, fear, and bureaucracy. Throughout the mid-1990s, Charles Cullen's deadly pattern became almost ritualistic. He would work the night shift, moving quietly through the darkened wards, his calm presence masking the chaos within. Using his access to medical supplies, he would withdraw doses of drugs, like digoxin, insulin, substances that could easily be fatal in the wrong hands, and administer them to patients who often weren't near death. Many of those victims were recovering, stable, or even preparing for discharge. Cullen later claimed he was ending their suffering, but his actions showed no mercy, only control. He thrived in the quiet hours when there were fewer staff around, taking advantage of the trust that came with his position. When the occasional death was investigated, he always had an excuse, a medical complication, an error in the system, or simply bad luck. His calm demeanor made him seem incapable of horror. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, his personal life continued to unravel. His marriage ended in divorce. He faced restraining orders and mental health crisis. He was admitted to a psychiatric facility multiple times after suicide attempts, yet somehow he still managed to find new nursing jobs. No one connected the dots, no one looked too closely, and every time that Cullen was allowed to walk away from one hospital, another unknowingly opened its doors to him. It was a grim cycle that turned the healthcare system into his hunting ground, and by the mid-90s, dozens of lives had already been lost under his watch. By the late 1990s, Charles Cullen's crimes had stretched across multiple hospitals, each one unknowingly enabling the next. The truth is that Cullen's killing spree wasn't just the work of one man. Each hospital had noticed unusual drug withdrawals, strange patient deaths, and unexplained overdoses, and they all faced a choice: report a nurse for possible murder, or quietly let him resign to avoid lawsuits and bad publicity. Time after time, they chose silence. St. Barnabas, Warren Hospital, Hunterdon Medical Center, Liberty Rehabilitation Center, Eastern Hospital, the list grew, and with each new job, Cullen found more victims. Even when pharmacists and fellow nurses raised concerns, administrators dismissed them or settled for internal reviews that went nowhere. There was no nationwide database tracking suspicious healthcare workers, and references between hospitals were often vague, filled with phrases like resigned in good standing. So Cullen thrived in this environment. He once admitted that if hospitals had simply stopped hiring him, he would have stopped killing. That chilling confession speaks volumes about the system's reluctance to confront hard truths. The very institutions meant to protect patients became complicit through negligence, and every new job he accepted represented another chapter in a preventable nightmare. As the year 2000 approached, Charles Cullen's double life was unravelling, but his killings continued. After leaving one hospital under suspicion, he found work at Eastern Hospital in Pennsylvania, where he struck again, killing yet another patient with a lethal dose of digoxin. Each time he moved on without consequence, aided by a healthcare system that seemed determined to not look too closely. But outside the hospital, Cullen's life was collapsing. His ex-wife had filed restraining orders describing him as mentally unstable and dangerous. He was drinking heavily, isolating himself, and growing increasingly detached from reality. His mental health deteriorated to the point where he was admitted multiple times to psychiatric wards for suicide attempts. Yet each release saw him return to nursing, as if nothing had happened. Hospitals were desperate for staff and rarely dug deep into an applicant's past, and Cullen exploited that desperation perfectly. He found employment at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville in 2002, a move that would ultimately seal his fate. There, surrounded by new colleagues who had no idea of his history, he continued his quiet rampage. But this time, something was different. The deaths began piling up too quickly, and the hospital's computer systems, more advanced than those in his earlier jobs, started flagging irregular patterns in medication access. Cullen's arrogance, honed by years of getting away with murder, had blinded him to the fact that technology and a few sharp-eyed co-workers were finally catching up to him. At Somerset Medical Center, Charles Cullen's years of evading detection were finally numbered. By 2002, the hospital had implemented computerized medication systems that tracked every drug withdrawal, creating digital footprints that Cullen could no longer erase. Pharmacists began to notice strange activity, unexplained requests for digoxin and insulin, medications that weren't prescribed to his patients or even needed on his floor. Cullen often logged into the system under the pretense of routine care, withdrawing doses and later discarding them after using them to kill. Soon, a growing number of unexpected patient deaths coincided with his shifts, and suspicions began to surface among staff. Amy Lauren, who had become close friends with Cullen, began to sense something was wrong. She had noticed his strange behaviour, the long stares, the cryptic comments about death, and the unsettling calm when patients died. But she dismissed it, believing he was just eccentric. When the hospital's internal investigation revealed his name appearing repeatedly in medication logs tied to suspicious deaths, administrators could no longer ignore it. Still, they hesitated to call police, fearing legal repercussions. But when one of Cullen's victims, Florian Gull, died after a sudden digoxin overdose, the pattern was undeniable. The New Jersey Poison Control Center got involved, urging Somerset to take immediate action. Behind the sterile walls of the hospital, whispers grew louder, and the man who had been hiding in plain sight for 16 years was finally starting to lose control of his deadly secret. As suspicions mounted at Somerset Medical Center, the investigation into Charles Cullen took an unexpected turn, one led by a friend. Nurse Amy Lauren, who had worked alongside Cullen for years, was one of the few people he seemed to trust. She described him as quiet, intelligent, and oddly gentle, someone she had confided in and defended when others found him strange. But when the hospital's pharmacy team showed her the data logs, his name repeatedly linked to fatal overdoses, her world shattered. Amy didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. She realized she had been working side by side with a serial killer, someone who might have been murdering patients right under her nose. Law enforcement approached her for help, asking her to wear a wire and continue speaking with Cullen to draw out a confession. It was an emotional nightmare. Betrayal, fear, guilt, and disbelief all colliding at once. Still, she agreed, knowing that if she couldn't help, more patients might die. In a series of tense recorded conversations, Amy gently confronted Cullen, probing his motives, his sense of guilt, and his cryptic statements about helping people. Her courage under pressure became the turning point in the case. For years, hospitals and administrators had failed to stop him, but one nurse's bravery would finally bring his reign of terror to an end. As the police listened in from a nearby van, the trap was being set, and Charles Cullen's long career of killing was finally closing in on him. In December 2003, after 16 years of silent killing, thanks to Amy Lauren's cooperation, detectives from Somerset County Prosecutor's Office gathered enough evidence to confront him. Cullen, cold and evasive, spoke in riddles about suffering and mercy, about patients who didn't need to live. Detectives could tell he was cracking under pressure. The following day, on December 12, 2003, police arrested him at a restaurant without incident. Even in custody, Cullen was detached and eerily calm, as if he had been expecting this all along. When investigators began questioning him, they were stunned to see how casually he spoke about ending their lives. Over time, Cullen confessed to at least 40 murders across 9 hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, though authorities believe the true number could exceed 400, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. He described his killings with little emotion, often framing them as acts of mercy, insisting that he was relieving patients of pain. But investigators saw through the lie. It wasn't mercy, it was obsession, control, and the twisted satisfaction of wielding life and death in his hands. The biggest question was, why? After his arrest, the world wanted to understand why Charles Cullen had done what he did. He said that he wanted to end patients' suffering, that he couldn't stand to see them in pain. But the truth was more complex, and far darker. Many of his victims weren't terminal. Some were recovering and expected to go home. His actions didn't follow any moral code or pattern of mercy. They followed his own inner chaos. Psychologists who studied him later described a man driven by deep-seated depression, narcissism, and a compulsion to control life and death. Killing may have been the only way he felt powerful in a world he viewed as cruel and meaningless. He spent his entire life feeling invisible, and in the hospital where he was surrounded by the fragile and dying, he became the unseen hand of fate. Cullen's warped sense of purpose turned caregiving into killing, and mercy into murder. What made his crimes even more chilling was how methodically he justified them. Each injection, each overdose, framed as helping, even though he often didn't know his victims' pain levels, diagnoses, or wishes. This self-delusion created a moral vacuum where he could play God without guilt. Investigators, psychologists, and even Amy Lauren struggled to comprehend how someone capable of compassion could also be capable of such systemic evil. But as Cullen's trial approached, one truth became undeniable: his motives might never be fully understood, and no explanation could ever justify the devastation he caused. When Charles Cullen finally stood before a judge, the weight of nearly 2 decades of hidden murder filled the courtroom. In 2006, he pleaded guilty to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders, committed across multiple hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Prosecutors were stunned by both the scale and coldness of his crimes, but what shocked many more was his demeanour, calm, expressionless, almost detached, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. During one sentence hearing, Cullen repeatedly interrupted the judge, muttering, "Your Honour, you need to step down," over and over until he was forcibly removed from the courtroom. The victims' families watched in disbelief as the man responsible for their grief showed no sign of remorse, no hint of empathy. Cullen was handed 11 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would never be eligible for parole. The judge called his actions evil beyond measure. For the families of the victims, the sentencing offered some closure, but no real peace. Many would later speak about the pain of not knowing exactly how their loved ones had died, or why Cullen had chosen them. The hospitals, meanwhile, faced lawsuits, investigations, and public outrage for their failure to act sooner. Yet in the midst of that chaos, one small comfort emerged. Charles Cullen would never again touch another patient, never again hide behind the mask of mercy. The very institutions designed to heal allowed a serial killer to thrive in the mist for 16 years. Public outrage demanded change. New Jersey passed a new law called Cullen Law. This required hospitals and healthcare facilities to report suspicious behaviour, all to a centralised database, ensuring that someone like Cullen could never quietly resign and move to another hospital. Other states soon followed with similar ideas. Today, Charles Cullen sits in a New Jersey prison, serving 11 consecutive life sentences, with no chance of parole until the year 2403, and I suspect he might not be around then. His name has become synonymous with betrayal, a nurse who turned care into cruelty, and who used the trust of patients and colleagues as his weapon. But beyond the horror, his story has forced an uncomfortable reckoning within the systems meant to protect us. The Cullen case exposed the cracks in the healthcare system. For those who knew him, like Amy Lauren, that experience left lifelong scars. In interviews and documentaries, she's spoken about the trauma of realising her friend, the man she laughed with, confided in, and trusted, was a serial killer. In the end, Charles Cullen will be remembered not for the lives he saved, but for the countless ones he stole, and the system that let him do it.